Good evening, everyone. It is so good to see all of the folks that are joining us tonight for this important program. What a great turnout. I am Bob Horenstein. I am the Director of Community Relations and Public Affairs for the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland, one of tonight's co-sponsors. If you are not familiar with the Federation's Jewish Community Relations Council, or JCRC, our work focuses, among other things, on protecting the social safety net, promoting civil rights for all citizens, and of course, combating bigotry, racism, anti-Semitism, and hate in all of its forms. I want to thank our other partners for tonight, starting first and foremost with the Portland chapter of the NAACP, the Remember the Hope congregation, which is led by Emmett Wheatfall, who will be our moderator tonight. Also, the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education, the Latino Network, Western States Center, Pride Northwest, the Gay Lesbian Archives of the Pacific Northwest, the Native American Youth and Family Center, and the Confederation of Grand Ronde Tribes. So this is very much a collective effort. Now, tonight's program is the first in a series of webinars that will be focusing on the history of discrimination in the state of Oregon, a state that my family has called home for the last 113 years. So as you can imagine, this is very personal to me. In the coming weeks and months, there will be several programs that focus on a particular minority community, starting as early as next week on Indigenous Peoples Day, October 12th, a special start time, 5:30 p.m. December 3rd will be a program on the Latinx immigrant community. Then in January, we will be doing the LGBTQ community. In February, we are hoping to do a webinar on the Asian community. And then in March, we'll be doing a program on the history of anti-Semitism in Oregon. So stay tuned for details. Now you may ask, why are we focusing on this history? And I want to give two reasons. I'm sure there are many more. Number one, this hidden history has been ignored and whitewashed in society and in our schools. And it's very important that we take the time to learn it. And second, we believe that in order to move forward, sometimes you have to look back. If we want to have an understanding of how did we get to the point where we are today in society, where we're still facing serious racial injustices, serious discrimination, we believe that it's important to understand where it all came from and how we got to where we are. So in addition to the history, we also are planning a summit at the end of May, the last week in May to be exact. We don't have a date yet. We don't know if it'll be virtual or in person. God willing, it will be in person, but a summit on confronting hate, where we will take the current issues around systemic racism, the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism, the rise in anti-immigrant hate, and other important topics, and also discussions centering on those resources and strategies for us to come together to be able to stand in solidarity to confront hate. We hope that you will join us for all of these important programs, and you will see the interconnectedness between these forms of discrimination, which are very important for you to hear about and be able to learn about and ask questions about. So please join us. You'll see the details. Coming in the future. So with that, I would like to call on my friend and colleague and an important social justice voice in Portland, the president of the NAACP, Pastor E.D. Mondinay.
Thank you, Bob, and welcome everyone. And I want to say to you, good evening. I am E.D. Mondinay, and I'm president of the NAACP branch 1120, local here in Portland, Oregon. In May 2020, Americans watched in horror at the horizontal concrete lynching of George Floyd, only to be later introduced to Breonna Taylor an up-and-coming medical professor that was guilty of sleeping while Black, fatally wounded by police officers by the authority in the hand of a no-knock warrant issued by the Kentucky Department of Justice. More recently, this past Saturday, October 3rd, 2020, we hear the news of Jonathan Price, a young Black man shot down by police in Texas for interrupting a neighborhood fight. We understand now more than we ever have in our lived experience or history, the plight of racism. While we are busy fighting a dual pandemic of racism 2020 and COVID-19, we are introduced with a hostile White House that refuses to denounce white supremacy and the denunciation of bad acting across these United States of America. We are in a time that we'll never ever regain. And the time for our beloved community to stand up in united force is right now. I am so glad that you're with us, and I'm glad that we have a very special guest who my friend Emmett Wheatfall is going to introduce next, that is going to give us some clarity on how we got here, when we got here, and perhaps what we have to do to get out. Thank you again for joining us, and we're glad that you're here. Emmett?
All right. Thank you, Pastor Mondane. We want to begin on behalf of the partnering organizations for tonight's presentation. We want to thank you for taking time out of your day to join with us on this very important topic. You know, our country has a confluence of many different things happening, but there's a social justice movement afoot for which the topic that we're going to share with you tonight has important relevance. You know, you can't understand your presence or your future without having an opportunity to take a look at the past. So we want to tell you thank you so much for making time this evening for this important presentation. I'm your moderator for this evening, and my role is first off to let you know, I want to let you know that we have probably close to 500 plus folks that have signed up to be participants in this particular program tonight, and you're included in that. We want to let you know that the chat feature has been disabled. There's no way that we can manage the chat feature, but there's a Q&A feature. If you're looking by Zoom, you can post your question in that Q&A feature of this Zoom presentation. And what we will do is that I'll try to find time, you know, pluck out some really good questions that can add, that you would want asked. I'll probably ask some questions. Our keynote will speak for about, I always like to let people know about how long, because then they can gear themselves for their attentiveness, about 45 minutes to an hour. And then we've set aside about 30 minutes for your questions and questions from the moderator. So we're going to really try to end at 8:30 for sure. You know, at this particular juncture, it is indeed my privilege and my pleasure to introduce to you tonight our keynote speaker. And her name is Walida Emarisha. And here's what I'd like for you to know about her. We're very fortunate to have her this evening. She's a writer, she's an author, she's an activist, an educator, a historian, a spoken word artist, especially that poetry, that spoken word, love that part of it. But that's just who she is. And I'd like to say it is a great opportunity for us to hear from her. I'd like to refer to Walida as something. I asked her in a lead up to this. I think I'd like to call her the People's Scholar. And the reason why I've chosen the People's Scholar is because there are a lot of people who have a lot of knowledge about history, but the only place you can get it is either in a book or you can get it at an academic institution. But we tonight have in living color the People's Scholar. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you tonight Walida Emarisha. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Emma. Thank you for that introduction. And I'm really honored to be called the People's Scholar. I hope that I earn it. And I'm so thankful to be part of this series. So thankful to be asked to share my work around Oregon Black history tonight. You know, I think it's important to know this history at any time, but I think especially in this moment when there is so much incredible organizing work happening, mobilization changes nationally and here in Portland, with folks courageously being out in the streets for well over 100 days. And I think it's incredibly important to root in that history of where we are, and the history of the Black community here as well, because this resistance is Black-led and it did not come out of nowhere. So as Emmett said, I'm going to give a brief presentation sharing some slides from my Oregon Black History timeline. And then we're going to have time for question and answer. I'm definitely very much want to kind of give a condensed, though it may not feel that way, but a condensed overview of some of these pieces of history, so that we have more time for question and answer, so we can really focus in on what y'all are interested in, because there is so much history, so much we could talk about. I want to make sure that we're talking about what is interesting to folks here. So please do feel free to use the Q&A. You can even be posting questions, as I'm speaking, and when we get to the question and answer portion, we'll explore those. So I wanted to give just a few disclaimers before we start. This is by no means comprehensive. It is a overview of some key historical moments that get to Oregon Black history and Oregon history, because Oregon Black history is Oregon history, just like the histories of people of color is the history of the United States, of this world. We cannot begin to understand this place we are until we know this history. It affects all of our lives every minute of every day. And if you are not aware of this history or the impacts, that is a privilege. And it's important to learn that, because folks are carrying the weight of this history and this lived reality every single day. So again, a few more disclaimers. I am specifically focusing on Black history. That is my area of focus. I was really excited to be part of this program because it does offer opportunities to go into the different experiences of different communities. It is incredibly important to recognize that though much of the oppression that shapes communities here comes from a common source, that oppression has looked different and communities have resisted and responded differently. So it's really important to learn those individual histories. And I encourage you to participate in the rest of this series, as well as, finding out other opportunities to learn those histories for yourself. Again, this is, Oregon Black history. It is also the history of race, identity, and power here in Oregon, in the Northwest, and I posit the country as well. And I will talk about that. But again, I don't believe we can understand this place we are without understanding this information. And lastly, I really want to highlight, and I've worked to highlight in my presentation, the resistance of specifically the Black community and other oppressed communities. It's incredibly important to never frame oppressed communities as passive victims. They've always been active change makers. And so I think it's incredibly important to root there rather than just talking about the oppression, to be clear that the minute that there was repression, there was resistance, and it has continued. As Dr. Karen Gibson says, there's been a continuous threat of resistance in the Black community here in Portland and through all oppressed communities. So, and I think the last piece, I just wanted to echo what Bob was saying. My subtitle for this program is A Hidden History. I've been doing this presentation for, I think, over 8 years now. If you can name a small town in Oregon, I probably was there talking about the history of race, identity, and power pre-COVID, obviously. I've done this, well, hundreds of times to, thousands of folks. And when I do it, I always ask folks who went to Oregon public schools and who learned this history. And, the numbers are abysmal. I might need a third hand at this point, given all of the people and the number of years I've been doing it. It's important to recognize this is a hidden history, as is the history of most communities of color in Oregon. It's something that is not taught, and certainly not taught accurately in public school curriculums historically or currently. Hopefully that will change in the future with the ethnic studies requirement that's going to be coming into play in a couple years. But as of now, this remains a hidden history that is often not accessible to folks. So I'm going to start sharing my screen with people. And again, I will be using slides from my Oregon Black History program, which you can find if you just look up Oregon Black History Timeline. You can find a YouTube video that contains about 50 slides, as well as some audio commentary. So I just offer this as a resource because I'll be going through this information fairly quickly and obviously a much abbreviated form. So if you are wanting more of this history, this is one resource for that. So if you just Google or go to YouTube, Oregon Black History Timeline, you can find the timeline in a video format. Also, if you look up Hidden History Oregon Humanities Magazine, this will come up and you click the first link and it will take you to a piece that I wrote a while ago now, 7 years ago. But it's a short article, and then it actually includes an excerpt of the timeline that you can engage with as an interactive online timeline. So those are the two different ways that you can access this information, is Googling Oregon Black History Timeline for the video, or looking up Hidden History Oregon Humanities Magazine for the written and online interactive timeline. So just wanting to go back to the beginning and start. And to be clear, I've met many Oregonians who are very proud that Oregon came into the Union a free state. And while it is true that Oregon outlawed slavery when it was still part of the Oregon Territory in 1844, I would never call it a free state, because at the same time that the Oregon Territory outlawed slavery, it also outlawed Black people. It criminalized Black existence and said we were not allowed to be in the territory. The original Black exclusion law also included the lash law that said that Black people would be publicly whipped up to 39 lashes every 6 months until they left the territory. And to be clear, the Oregon Territory encompassed Washington, Oregon, Idaho, parts of Wyoming, parts of Montana. So when you said the Oregon Territory, you said the entire Northwest. So the entire Northwest in 1844 outlawed Black existence here and said we would be publicly tortured over and over again until we left. This was actually the first of 3 Black exclusion laws that passed overwhelmingly and had immense favorable support from white people in first the Oregon Territory and then Oregon as a state. So this is, the foundation of why we are here. And it's important to recognize that the Black exclusion laws speak to the mentality of the white colonizers who created this state and colonized this region. The idea behind this region, the entire Northwest, was to create a racist white utopia. The idea was that white people would come to this place and build the sort of white society that they had dreamed about building since they began colonizing North and South America. And so The Black exclusion laws have to be seen as part of that. They outlawed slavery not because they believed slavery was an unjust system, but because they did not want enslaved Black people being brought here, because they did not want Black folks being here, because they wanted to create a whites-only society. We can also see that clearly in the language that they use themselves. So Peter Burnett was a legislator in Oregon who was incredibly influential. He actually went on to become governor of California. The lash law, again, that dictated Black people would be publicly whipped until we left, was called Peter Burnett's lash law. And he said about the law itself, the object is to keep clear of that most troublesome class of population, Black people. We are in a new world under the most favorable circumstances, and we wish to avoid most of those evils that have so much afflicted the United States and other countries. So he was incredibly clear, and so were the white colonizers of this land, very clear that the goal was to build a racist white utopia. This can also be seen and how it affected other groups here through things like the Oregon Donation Land Act of 1850, which stole, at the end of the day, 2.5 million acres of indigenous land and gave it away for free to white people to literally build this racist white utopia upon. So that is the foundation of this place, is as a racist white utopia. And laws like the Black exclusion laws and the Oregon Donation Land Act show how that is built on the exploitation and the exclusion and the brutality against Black, Indigenous, and other folks of color. This mentality of a racist white utopia resulted in Oregon being the only state in the union admitted with a racial exclusionary clause in its constitution. So the third exclusion law was written into Oregon's constitution, and it banned Black folks from holding real estate, from making contracts, from living in the state. There are many things that are very important about this. Two I want to highlight that are on this slide is that while the law was repealed in 1926, because of the organizing work of the Black community, the language was not removed from the Constitution. It went to the ballot in 2001, and it was not removed until 2002. And so that language was left in the Constitution until 2002. And this was not an oversight, because again, the Black community has never been passive victims, but active change makers. And so they came to white Oregon again and again, both through the legislature and the ballot box, and said, prove to us this is not the kind of place that you want to live. And by leaving that language in again and again, white Oregon reaffirmed for decades, actually, this is exactly the kind of place that we want to live. And for anyone who was here in the 21st century, you know it was a fight to get that language removed. So there was pushback around that. It went to the ballot, and 30% of Oregonians voted to leave in the Black exclusion language in the Constitution. And much of this pushback against removing it was framed as wanting to preserve Oregon's history, which many heard as wanting to preserve the foundations of this racist white utopia. The other piece that I want to point out that, again, I think is incredibly important is that in 1860, the census identified 124 Black people in Oregon. And while that number may seem incredibly small out of 52,000, it's incredibly inspiring to me, because that meant there were over 100 Black folks who heard about the multiple Black exclusion laws, the public torture, the many other ways that this state and this region said, we do not want you here. And they said, well, I'm not leaving, so now what? That is immense courage and determination, and it is the only reason that there are Black communities here now. So again, I really want to root in the resistance of Black communities and to recognize that the fact that Black communities exist in Oregon at all is incredible, because we were never supposed to be here. And yet we have always been here, and we have always not only survived, but thrived and built nurturing communities in the face of a place that not only didn't want us, but actively and brutally tried to exclude and expel us. The other piece that I was talking about before is I think Oregon is an incredibly useful case study for the rest of the nation, because the same policies, practices, and ideologies that shaped Oregon shaped every state in the union and shaped the United States as a country. And so while Oregon was bold enough to write it down, the same mentality exists across this nation. The notion of manifest destiny is the creation of a racist white utopia. The idea that God gave this land to white folks because indigenous people weren't using it properly, and they had the right to do whatever was necessary, including chattel slavery, genocide, theft of an entire continent to make it quote unquote productive. That is the essence of manifest destiny. And this is a quote from a US senator who said this not in the 1600s or 1700s or the 1800s, but in the 1900s. God has not been preparing the English-speaking and Teutonic peoples for 1,000 years for nothing but vain and idle self-admiration. No, he has made us the master organizers of the world to establish system where chaos reigns. He has made us adept in government that we may administer government among savages. Were it not for such a force as this, the world would relapse into barbarism and night. So again, that is the same mentality that we heard from Peter Burnett, and is very clear that that is the foundation of this state and this nation. In line with that, we can see the ways that white supremacy has actively manifested here in Oregon. And we can talk a lot more about this if folks are interested. But obviously there has been an immense mobilization of white supremacist fascists in Portland and in Oregon and across this nation as of late. But that has always existed here. This is not new. And in fact, with a foundation like this, it only makes sense that Oregon and the Northwest were known as havens for white supremacists. And this is true down through history, from the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, which we'll talk about in a minute, to the Nazi Bund having an office in downtown Portland in the 30s, to Portland being called the skinhead capital of the country in the 1980s. This is something that is part of the foundation of this place that we live. And it is not enough to just try to pretend that that is not what we have built an entire society on, and what is shaping all of the institutions that shape our lives. So I find the Klan to be a useful case study because there are lots of racial myths that exist about the Ku Klux Klan, which is a national terrorist organization. And one of those is just the slip that I made, that the Klan was something that existed in the past but died out. There are actually over 100 active Klan chapters in this country at this moment. The Klan, some of the other racist myths are that the Klan membership was mostly educated or not formally educated working class white men, that it existed primarily in the South, that it was existed on an extreme spectrum of the political landscape in the United States. None of those things is true. So the Klan at its height nationally had 15% of white men, which is all they wanted, as members of the organization across this nation. Oregon is believed to have the highest per capita Klan membership in the country. And this is at a time when communities of color, when Jewish communities, when Catholic communities are small because they have been brutally kept so by the white majority. So this Klan membership was also about sending a message about what kind of place people wanted to live in. The Klan's power also reached into the highest echelons of government. And this picture, which ran in the newspaper, showing the police chief, the district attorney, the US attorney, the county sheriff, the chief of police, and the Portland mayor posing with hooded Klansmen under a headline saying they are taking leadership about what the Klan wants for Portland, shows that. The Klan reached into the highest echelons of power in Portland and in Oregon. In 1922, Walter Pierce was elected through the immense support of the Klan and worked with the Klan to pass numerous pieces of legislation that were racist, that were anti-Semitic, that were anti-Catholic, and one of the main ones they're known for is the Compulsory Education Act, which eliminated private schools. But they also passed voting literacy tests, which we think of as a racist method of control over voting in the South. But we had them here in the North as well, in Oregon, thanks to Walter Pierce and the Ku Klux Klan. Lastly, again, Oregon is a useful case study for the rest of the nation because that same parallel played out nationally. So in the United States, around this time, the president was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson actually wrote a pro-Klan history book, which was the basis for the novel The Klansman, which became the basis for the film Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation is perhaps the most virulently racist film that has ever been created. It glorified the birth of the Klan as absolutely necessary to protect white society and especially white womanhood. It was also, Birth of the Nation was also the first film to screen in the White House. And Woodrow Wilson would show it as if it were a documentary to visiting dignitaries. So again, the idea that the Klan was not a fringe organization, it was not something that was in conflict with the way that American politics and ideology happened. It sits at the heart of the American ideology. The other piece that's important, and as you can see here, I wanted to highlight the resistance to it, because there was immense organizing by numerous organizations led by the NAACP, which is one of tonight's co-sponsors, here in Portland and nationally, to challenge the screening of Birth of a Nation. Because wherever Birth of a Nation screened, there would be immense violence that happened against Black communities by white mobs who were leaving seeing that film. And back then, films would screen year after year after year. And so in taking the national leadership from the NAACP, the Portland chapter of the NAACP and other Black community organizations and leaders worked to boycott Birth of a Nation, and then worked and successfully petitioned the city council to ban the screening of, quote, any film which would stir up racial hatred or hatred between the races, and then later specifically banned Birth of a Nation from screening. And I think this is incredibly inspiring, especially to think about that time period, what it meant to be Black in 1916, in the 1920s, and the courageous organizing that it took to stand up against the Klan and to demand basic protections under the law at a time where attacks against Black folks were happening across this nation and here in Portland. So, I'm just going to highlight some other areas of resistance. And now I'm kind of talking about really rooting in, as I said, that history of Black resistance. And so, I wanted to be clear that this is not something that happened once or twice. This is something that happened continually, that the Black community in Oregon has always used a diversity of tactics and strategies to work to create racial justice, which is absolutely necessary for justice to exist. You cannot have justice without racial justice. And people of color in general, and specifically in this context, the Black community, have always been the ones who have led the work on creating racial justice. Sometimes with the support of white allies and accomplices, sometimes not, but there has never been a moment when communities of color have not been organizing to create racial justice. So one year that was very important for that was 1867, where both Salem and Portland Black communities organized to get access to public education for Black students who were at that point denied education. And specifically Salem's Black community raised $427.50 to start a school for Black children, and then pressured the Salem School District to take over the cost of managing it. And again, that organizing is incredibly courageous, and even more so when you realize that this is at a time where Black folks had no legal standing or legal protections in Oregon, and still they were organized and fighting, not just for themselves, but for access that broadened education for all, that other folks of color and other marginalized groups were able to get access to public education because of the fight of the Black community. And while my presentation kind of going forward is going to be looking at Black community space making in Portland as a case study around that, I just wanted to be clear and highlight that Black communities made home across the state in every environment that they entered into. And so I wanted to raise up the example of Maxville, where 60 Black workers came to work for the lumber industry there, bringing their families with them and creating a community. And there's actually a great documentary by Gwen Trice called The Logger's Daughter that you can watch on OPB for free. And she has actually created a interactive exhibit around Maxville as well. And so when we are through COVID, I encourage folks to go to that area, to Wallowa County, and to see that exhibit and to see that documenting of this important Black history in Eastern Oregon. So again, I just wanted to highlight there are many different ways that resistance happens, and one of those is cultural. And I think it is incredibly important to center cultural organizing and cultural resistance. And so I wanted to lift up this piece of history that Portland was actually known as a jazz treasure nationally, and all of the greats played here. And on Williams Avenue, you could hear jazz 24 hours a day. And just how incredible that is in a city that was called the most segregated city north of the Mason-Dixon line. So the most segregated city outside of the South, in a community that was overexploited and under-resourced. They created a jazz culture of resistance that was seen and respected nationally. And that is an important form of resistance as well. Talking about historic Black organizations, the Urban League of Portland and other supporters actually successfully lobbied legislation in 1953 to pass Oregon's Civil Rights Bill, which is ahead of some of the other civil rights legislation that's happening across the country and nationally at that time as well. And so again, it's important to root in the fact that white allies and accomplices were absolutely important in this in these victories, but these efforts were led by the Black community and at great risk to the Black organizers who engaged in this work and fought for the Black community and for justice throughout Oregon. I wanted to highlight this example of the Black Panther Party before I move on to the last piece that looks at sort of housing and space making, because the Black Panther Party is a incredibly useful example of what happens when communities of color pull together their own resources to create community-based institutions. Oftentimes, I think that when we're talking about allocating funds, there is a scarcity model that is really based on that idea of a pie, that there are only so many pieces to go around. But we see that when communities of color, their leadership and their voices are centered, they create institutions that actually make our entire communities stronger, healthier, and more whole. So specifically, the Black Panther Party was a national organization. At its height, it had 50 chapters. Oregon actually had 2 chapters. Portland and Eugene had Black Panther Party chapters. The only program that every chapter of the Black Panther Party was mandated to have was a free breakfast for children program. We actually have free and reduced lunch programs in schools because of the Black Panther Party. That is a federally funded program that started soon after the Panthers let it be known that they were feeding tens of thousands of children every day with no federal funding, no grant money, just donations and contributions of time, resources, and energy. And in fact, in 1969, the California treasurer said that the Black Panther Party fed more children every day than the United States government. One of the other programs that most of the Panther chapters had was a free healthcare clinic. Portland actually had 2 clinics. They had a general healthcare clinic, and then they had a dental clinic. It was the only Black Panther chapter in the country to have a dental clinic. That dental clinic was actually taken over by OHSU and is still operating today, providing low-income dental care to that community. So because of the Black Panther Party, that community has had under the Panthers free dental care and under OHSU low-income dental care for 50 years at this point. And so I think, again, it's just important to show that when resources and leadership and vision of communities of color are centered, they create institutions that make our whole community safer, healthier, and more whole. So this piece, I just want to go through pretty quickly. There's a lot to talk about. I know there are a lot of conversations happening around gentrification, around space in Portland, given that Portland is the most gentrified city of the century. So I'm going to go through this quickly. I'm happy to talk more specifically if folks are interested in that. But to just be clear that, again, Black communities have always existed in Oregon, and that in and of itself is an act of resistance. So the first large influx of Black folks came in the 1880s with the completion, with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And so the first Black community actually sprung up to address the needs of folks who were working on the trains and coming through, because the entirety of Portland, and especially downtown, was pretty much closed to Black folks. Again, it was considered to be the most segregated city north of the Mason-Dixon line. So Black folks could not rent a room, they could not see a doctor, they could not eat in restaurants, on and on. So a small but thriving Black business community sprouted up around the train station. So the first Black community in Portland was actually in Northwest Portland, and it overlapped with Chinatown and Japantown near the train station. And it was there because white folks didn't want to live near the train station because it was loud and dirty and toxic. But the centerpiece of the Black community was the Golden West Hotel, which opened in 1906 to house those folks who were working on the railroads, but it quickly became a community center and the heartbeat of the Black community in Portland. What happened is what happens in many different places, is that as downtown expanded, that land became desirable and the Black community was displaced. And that was the first displacement of many displacements to come. Black folks were displaced across the Broadway Bridge to Lower Albina, which is where the Moda Center, the Memorial Coliseum is right now. And they were regulated by and large to Albina through many different means that were enforced by law, by government, by private practices. One of those institutions was the Portland Realty Board's Code of Ethics that mandated real estate agents were not allowed to sell or rent to people whose race was determined to lower the property values in that neighborhood. That law was later changed to explicitly say Black and Asian folks. And so folks were redlined into, racially segregated into Lower Albina. So while that was the only place by and large that Black folks were allowed to buy or rent in Portland, it was the Black community that made that Lower Albina the heart of the Black community. So I think that's, again, important to recognize the agency and the power of the Black community, that even under these brutal circumstances, folks rebuilt, they built businesses, community spaces, connections to support one another. The second large influx of Black folks came during World War II with the wartime efforts that were happening. So folks were being recruited to come from the South to the North to work in wartime industries. In Portland and in this area, it was mostly Kaiser shipyards. So at that time, Portland was very hostile to Black folks coming in. The mayor, in fact, was quoted on the front cover of the newspaper saying that we did not need any more Black people in Portland. But Kaiser needed these workers to work in his shipyard. So he ended up buying unincorporated land between Vancouver and Portland, called it Vanport, and built what became the second largest city in Oregon. And when he turned it over to the Housing Authority of Portland, it became the largest public housing project in the country. Now, and it was 40% Black. Now, even though while the war was still happening, the Housing Authority of Portland made plans to demolish Vanport and other public housing projects as soon as the war was done, because they did not want people to stay. They wanted them gone. They did not want these folks to think of Portland as a permanent home. There was immense organizing that was happening in Vanport through organizations like the Vanport Tenants League, which their two main things they were organizing around were quality housing and police violence in the 1940s. So again, that tells you this history has been happening for a long time. You know, as a side note, I don't actually even like to call this history. I call it a living legacy, because the reality is, at best, history is a spiral. We can continue up if we can look down and say, we've been here before. How do we learn those lessons and do something differently? But unfortunately, we end up often going in circles. But the reality is, this living legacy is with us every day. As many folks may know, Vanport ended up actually being completely destroyed in 1948 when the dams protecting it broke. And the folks, 17,000 folks were displaced, and disproportionately Black moved into Portland. And this is important because it is really one of the first times that we see Portland governance even feeling like they need to give the appearance of listening to Black issues and Black concerns on a larger citywide level. So again, I do not have the time right now to go into the whole history around gentrification, but I strongly encourage everyone to read Bleeding Albina by Dr. Karen Gibson, who taught at Portland State University's Urban Studies program. It gives an incredible history of housing, of race, of displacement. One of the really important things that Dr. Gibson says in this piece is that if you are only starting to talk about gentrification in the 1990s, then you cannot begin to understand the process of gentrification. That to truly understand gentrification, you have to start in the 1950s, because that was the first round of urban renewal. And that was the first time that we see on these large scales, you know, cities being completely reimagined and mostly working class communities of color being destroyed for, quote unquote, the greater good. One of the other things that is really powerful about Dr. Gibson's framing is that she is clear that gentrification is an intentional process, it is multi-decade, it is structural, and it is a partnership between private and public interests as well. And I think that all of those pieces are really important and challenge the way that gentrification often gets talked about. So we see this first wave of urban renewal hitting Albina, lower Albina, and pushing Black folks into upper Albina. So again, lower Albina is the place where folks were already displaced from downtown. 4 out of 5 Black folks lived in this thriving community. And then with the approval of constructing the Memorial Coliseum and then the highways going in later that year, hundreds of homes were destroyed and businesses were destroyed and a community was displaced. Then we see the second blow happening not too long after for folks in Upper Albina, where Emmanuel Hospital partnered with the city of Portland to take Black homes and to demolish them. They demolished 1,100 housing units, supposedly to build an expansion for Emmanuel Hospital. But the reality, and we can talk a lot more about this, is that the city of Portland had been clear that it wanted Albina to be demolished. And so it worked in partnership with Emmanuel Hospital to get that done. But the extensions that Emmanuel Hospital had planned on building were not approved for federal funding. So all of these people were displaced, these businesses were destroyed, this community was broken apart, and nothing was built on top of that land, in some cases for decades. So there are still empty lots around Emmanuel Hospital that are from this destruction that began in the 1970s. So that, is part of this process that Karen Gibson talks about of gentrification. In the 1980s, this process of neglect that happens, where communities are cut off, where services are reduced, where property values drop, rampant unemployment is happening, over-policing, brutal policing is happening in communities. All of these forces work together to lower the property values of those neighborhoods to the point where then it can be profitable for other folks outside of the neighborhood to come in and buy them. But just before I finish talking about gentrification, I just wanted to highlight the example of a police murder here, and there have been so many that could be talked about. But in 1985, Lloyd Stevenson was murdered by Portland police. And this is something that has continued to echo through the Black community. And it's echoing in communion with national movements from 2014, Eric Garner, who was choked to death by police in New York and said, "I can't breathe" 11 times, to George Floyd's murder, where he also couldn't breathe. Lloyd Stevenson actually stopped a crime from happening. He stopped a 7-Eleven from being robbed. And when police came, they put Lloyd Stevenson, the Good Samaritan, in a sleeper hold until his heart stopped. At his funeral, police officers created t-shirts that had "smoking gun" and the phrase that said, "Don't choke 'em, smoke 'em" on it. And they wore that the day of his funeral. So I think, again, it's important to recognize this resistance to police violence has been continuous and longstanding here in Portland and nationally. And there is a long memory in the Black community here about that. But just as I was saying, the last piece around gentrification comes in the 1990s. And that's when we begin to see sort of everything that's been growing underneath the surface sprout up. And we see the demographic shifts that are happening in North and Northeast Portland that have resulted in just completely drastic changes that have happened now. And I want to make sure that there's time for question and answer. So again, I'm more than happy to talk more about this if folks are interested. But I did want to say that, you know, in the process of gentrification, we're seeing Black communities being displaced in multiple directions. We're seeing folks being displaced outer east into Gresham. We're seeing folks being pushed north into Vancouver, Washington, out of the state. We're also seeing folks being forced into prisons. And to me, it's incredibly important to recognize that as part of the process of gentrification. Gentrification always works in tandem with brutal over-policing of communities. And we see incarceration rates rising at the same time that we're seeing gentrification beginning to happen as well. And in Oregon, it's through Measure 11, which set mandatory minimums that passed in 1994, that is responsible for the huge explosion in the prison population that disproportionately affects Black people. So often we talk about policing, police violence, incarceration as separate from gentrification. But to me, it's incredibly important to talk about them as intertwined and as interdependent. And the last piece, I just want to share a map that shows the changing demographics. So as you can see on this chart, the darkest color shows where the Black population is 50 to 64% of the population in that neighborhood. And so in 1970, there was a majority Black community that existed here, as well as other communities that had high percentages of Black folks in North and Northeast Portland. We see that continuing and even growing into 1980 and into 1990. We see the expansion into new areas and more folks having a majority Black community. And then we see 2000. And from 1990 to 2000, in less than 10 years, we no longer have any community that is majority Black in Portland. That's how quickly gentrification happened once it raised its head to the surface. So the most that we have is a community that is 30 to 49% Black. And then we go from 2000 to 2010. Again, in less than 10 years, we see that there is no longer any community that has more than 30% Black folks. So just to compare, you can see 1970 to 2010, the demographic changes that have happened. So I know that was a lot of information to share with y'all all at once, but I am excited to move into question and answer and to be in conversation with Emmett Wheatfall moving forward from here.
Well, Edie, I want to thank you very much for your concise presentation. Look, the amount of time that we've allotted doesn't allow you to go into the granular nature of your presentation, but really want to thank you very much for your concise presentation. You know, in terms of questions as a moderator, let me start with this question. And we have some people who've queued up some questions that I'll pose to you. We have about 32 minutes available to do this. So maybe if we could keep our answers and questions kind of short, we can get through as many of them as we can. I'd like to start off with the first question. How is this knowledge? Obviously, you've studied this, you present it, you teach it, it's a part of you. Could you share with us how this knowledge has informed your identity as a person of color, as a woman? How has this information impacted you?
Sure. Well, and I usually start with a little bit more about my history at the beginning, but I was like, I want to be concise. But I moved to Oregon to finish out high school. I moved from military bases. And so even though I was in very white places like Iceland and Germany, I lived on military bases, which are disproportionately people of color because folks of color are disproportionately recruited by the military. So the communities I grew up in were mostly Black and brown folks. So moving to Oregon to finish out high school was an immense culture shock. And I also moved to a small town in Oregon, and there was immense hostility from white students against students of color. And I just did not understand at that point. And I was incredibly lucky while I was still in high school to attend a presentation by Dr. Daryl Milner, who Emmett, you and I were talking about earlier. He is one of the preeminent historians on this work. He's served as my mentor on this. He helped to found the Black Studies Department at Portland State and has taught there for over 50 years. And to finally get this factual information to understand this place that I was thrust into and what was happening was incredibly important for me. And I am grateful every day that I received that information while I was still in high school, because it helped me to externalize the messaging here. I think that especially Portland is very adept at neoliberal racism, at using the language of progressivism, of liberalism, while allowing systems of oppression to continue and operate as business as usual. And what that often does, I think, is create a sort of collective and communal gaslighting of people of color by saying, you know, oh, but we're liberal here. That doesn't happen here. That's something that happens in the South. We value diversity. And we begin to question ourselves and are like, well, that's not my experience, but if everyone is saying that, then maybe. And I think knowing this, again, living legacy, because this is not a history, it is with us every minute of the day. Knowing this living legacy is incredibly important to externalize that information. And so again, I'm very thankful to Dr. Milner that I got the opportunity to learn that while I was still at a formative time. And it, changed the course of my life by making me want to share this information with as many people as possible, white allies and white accomplices, and especially, people of color, and especially Black folks, so that they could also externalize that and know that, no, it's not us. This place was not only never intended for us, it was set up to exploit and brutalize us. And until there is deep institutional fundamental work that happens to change that, we have to never let them tell us that's not what's happening.
I want to let our viewers and listeners know that we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions. So if your question doesn't get a chance to be asked, hopefully we can have Walida back in the future for another time and hopefully be able to get your questions in. So we're going to try to get some of these questions in. One of the viewers or listeners indicated you touched on the literacy voting test. Can you expand on how that was used in Oregon, and is it still on the books?
So many of these laws were repealed. Many of them were actually, deemed, so the Compulsory Education Act, which was passed around the same time as the literacy test, actually went all the way to the Supreme Court and was ruled unconstitutional. And so, but I think it's important to note that even whether these things are on the books or not, they are often left until very recently, if not actively till today, to serve as a message. So again, with the Black Exclusion law being left in the Constitution until 2002, with Oregon not finally ratifying the 14th and 15th Amendments, which guarantee universal citizenship right and outlaw voting discrimination based on race until 1973 and 1959, respectively. The fact that many of folks' covenants for their homes to this day have racial exclusionary language in them in places like, Lake Oswego and other parts of town. Black folks own homes that literally in their documentation, it says they are not allowed to enter unless they are a servant. And, the idea of leaving those in, I think, again, it's not about not knowing they're there, because the Black community has continually come forward and said, these things are still here. Is this the kind of place you want to be? I think you should change this. And again, as a whole, white Oregonians have reinforced until very recently, or even through today, that this is actually exactly the kind of place we
A
want.
lot of that old redlining is still in county code.
Exactly.
It's still in county code and ordinance like that.
Exactly.
Another question. Please clarify what you mean that Portland is the most gentrified city of the century.
So that it's statistically based on the matrix that's used around gentrification. It's statistically the most gentrified city of the century. I know that part of that is the increase of rates in housing prices, as well as the displacement of communities of color and working class folks. I don't know all of the matrices that are used for that, so I'd encourage people to look that up. But that Portland has earned that dubious title along with the whitest major city in America as well, statistically. And so actually, I would love to just really quickly share a couple slides about that, because I wasn't gonna share them, but this is the state of housing in Portland report from 2018. It was put out at the end of 2018. And so you can see that housing is horrific in Portland, as probably many of us know, especially if you are renting, to try and gain access to affordable housing. But if you are Black, if you are Indigenous, if you are Latinx, across the board, you cannot afford to live in Portland. And I encourage you to read the State of Housing in Portland report itself. This shows you the immense increase in home prices that has occurred only in the last 7 years at the point that this report was put out. But we can also see the median household income broken down by race. And so you can see that Black folks have the lowest median income in Portland compared to all other households, and especially in comparison to white households. And the last piece of this is looking at the home ownership rate by race and ethnicity. So you can see that not only do Black folks have the lowest home ownership rate in Portland, that the numbers actually decreased from 2011 to 2016 as well. So when we say the most gentrified city in America, these are some of the statistics and indicators that are used to highlight that.
That's a recent analysis, isn't it? It's not very old, that analysis you just shared.
It came out at the end of 2018.
Right, I thought so, about 2 years ago.
And it was put out by the Portland Housing Bureau.
Okay. Well, follow up, especially on that gentrification. There's a question that asks, what kind of actions do you think white individuals and white communities need to be aware of or look out for to prevent advancement of gentrification?
I mean, that's a huge question. And so, we could have spent the whole time on that. I would say fundamentally, and first of all, white folks need to be studying and learning about the organizing work that has historically and is currently happening by communities of color in general, and the Black community specifically on this issue. Because again, communities of color in general and the Black community specifically have never been passive victims. They've always been active change makers. They're also incredible organizers and thinkers. And so the Black community has been putting out strategies, policy recommendations, initiatives, long-term plans for decades around housing. And by and large, they have been ignored by the city. And so, again, I think it's incredibly important to look to those areas of knowledge and to look to the organizations that are already doing this. I would definitely encourage folks to look at the State of Black Oregon report. I believe the last time the full report was put out was 2015, but they have done an addendum as well, put out by the Urban League of Portland. And it shows you the racial disparities that exist across the state in dozens of different indicators, but it also proposes policy recommendations and changes. It highlights organizations that are working on those issues. Another incredible report that I would encourage everyone to read is the Portland African American Leadership Forum, PALF. They put out the Portland People's Plan. And this came out, I'm not sure quite when, a few years ago. But the process for creating that was to talk to hundreds of Black folks over dozens of visioning sessions for years, and to pull together policy recommendations and ideas based on that. And it's incredible, and it contains some very visionary ideas about how to address gentrification. So my number one thing to say is to look to the wisdom that has already been put out, and to look to the organizing that has already happened. When white allies and accomplices come to this work, that's incredibly important. But you cannot come to it as if this work has not been happening and been held by communities of color for decades or centuries, as you want to frame it. And so you need to do your research to recognize there's many active programs happening right now to combat gentrification in Portland, led by the Black community. This is not something where I think, honestly, a lot of white folks frame gentrification in Portland as, I mean, it's sad that it happened, but it happened and it's done, which often means, you know, I can feel okay about buying this house. The reality is Black folks are organizing to maintain the hold that they have in North and Northeast Portland. They're fighting and organizing around the right to return to North and Northeast Portland. And there are, you know, numerous, if not dozens, of organizing initiatives around that. So if you are a white ally or accomplice who truly actually wants to fight against gentrification, join and support the work that is already done, but don't come into this thinking that this is something brand new, because we have been holding this line for a very long time.
You know, we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to remind folks that I see the questions. I'm not going to be able to ask all of them, so I'm trying to keep some symmetry here with the questions. But, you know, I'd like to, as a moderator, to kind of take us out of Oregon and talk a little bit more on a national basis around anti-racism. I think you're capable and qualified to do that. There's a scholar theologian by the name of Mark Charles. I don't know if you're familiar with him. And he's done work on this idea called manifest destiny. And I think in your presentation, you referenced a person who said that, and I'm paraphrasing, that the white man was put here on earth to organize other cultures and civilizations. Could you address that kind of supremacy thinking, where that comes from? Why this idea that somehow whites, according to that person, is supposed to be the one that organizes other races and cultures as if they are inferior, and they were put here to do that by God.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think again that's something we could talk about for hours. There's, you know, tons of amazing books that are written about it. I'm actually like, I'm can look at some books on my shelf here that are focused on that. But you know, I think specifically in the context of the colonization of the United States, this idea is put forward to justify the theft and the genocide of an entire continent, the genocide of against indigenous folks, and the chattel slavery of Black folks that was brutally used to build America and to build the wealth of America. That is, I mean, that is the foundation of this nation, is stolen indigenous land and attempted indigenous genocide and chattel slavery. And so obviously, to justify that, it was incredibly important to say, for white folks to say, well, you know, indigenous folks are not using this land properly to make it productive, right? Which is a very Western European notion about how to use land and how to be in relationship to land. And it was very much about allowing for this hierarchy and this justification, which is the justification used for colonization around the world by white folks, that we are bringing these savages, you know, forward. We are bringing them civilization. They should actually be thankful and grateful to us because we are lifting them up closer to our level. And that was used to justify the atrocities and brutalities that continue and that form the foundation of this society and of this nation. And it's absolutely and fundamentally and starkly clear here in the Northwest and in Oregon, where again, you know, this wasn't 1492, this wasn't the 1600s, the 1700s. Folks are reiterating this into the 1800s, into the 1900s, showing this ideology is not only very much alive, but is shaping the foundations of this nation.
As a scholar, what would your response be to, there's a body of scholars that look at the United States Constitution and say that it is a white racist doctrine, a white racist instrument, because what it did, it excluded the African that was brought here by slave, it excluded women, indigenous First Nations people were lower probably than that, and that the key to the Constitution was the right to land, to own land. So as a result, that the Constitution in its ideals and its creeds were not necessarily inclusive of everybody. How would you respond to that as a scholar and theologian? Scholar, not necessarily a theologian.
Yeah, I mean, I would say absolutely. I think that's a completely valid critique and way of looking at and framing that, because that is historically accurate. When we look at why, you know, it was a group of, again, overwhelmingly white male slave owners as well. It's not just rich white men, it's rich white men who owned enslaved Black folks as well, who came together and created the foundations of this nation on stolen Indigenous land. And so, you know, for me, part of showing history is so that we can fundamentally question how we want to be in the present and especially in the future, and do the work now to change that. And so I think it's, you know, I would hope that folks would recognize that nothing is sacrosanct, nothing is untouchable, especially when it is birthed in these contexts. And so for me, my philosophy on almost everything is take what is useful, take what is relevant, take what still works, and leave the rest, and then reimagine into the future. And
let me ask you, what do you think that Christianity has some culpability in terms of what happened in the founding of this nation?
oh, absolutely. I mean, again, Manifest Destiny literally says that God gave this land to white men to make prosperous because Indigenous people weren't using it correctly. It's kind of like there's no higher authority you can call on. You're like, I mean, God told me, so you gonna argue with God? No, I don't think so, right? So, I mean, built into the fundamentals of Manifest Destiny is a white supremacist framework around Christianity that allowed for colonization, exploitation, and brutality of communities of color to accumulate wealth and capital.
We got about 10 minutes left. I want to bring it back more local if we can, because there's some questions in here about locality, and especially the current social justice movement that's happening with BLM and stuff like that, Black Lives Matter. In addressing police brutality, particularly against Blacks and other people of color, which institutional reforms do you consider most important?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of things that need to change. For me, what is most important about this work that I hope folks take away and at least mull over, if not agree with, is that the institutions that shape all of our lives are deeply, fundamentally, and inextricably linked to white supremacy. That again, these institutions were created not only to support white people and to create a racist white society, but specifically to exploit, exclude, and brutalize communities of color. So I think that we fundamentally have to reimagine what safety looks like, what justice looks like, how resources are utilized, that actually roots in a true vision of justice. So I have personally been an abolitionist. I believe in the abolition of police and prisons for decades. And
So, when you say abolition, you better explain what you mean by
yeah.
abolition.
So so I believe that police and prisons actually make us all less safe, not more safe. And I think and I know that there are many ways that communities have and are addressing harm that happens that focuses on healing and restoration and transformation rather than punishment and retribution. And so I have been incredibly inspired by the current wave of Black Lives Matter protests nationally, internationally, and here in Portland. And the fact that they're still going so strong here in Portland, because they have also rooted in an understanding that we have been trying to reform police departments for decades. That places like Minneapolis have instituted every police reform that we have been offered. Places like Portland, which again is a sort of neoliberal haven, have instituted many of these reforms, and it has not changed the lived experience or the ways that Black communities are targeted and brutalized. And so I think that we have reached a point where folks are saying, then we fundamentally have to reimagine this. And we have to begin to shift resources away from these institutions that brutalize communities and towards those communities. And to be clear, these resources are not a gift, because these resources have been extracted from communities of color for centuries. Nationally, as I said, from stolen Indigenous land, from chattel slavery of Black folks, from forced and exploited labor of immigrant folks. And here in Portland, especially, those resources were extracted from communities of color for centuries, even though communities of color never saw benefits from them. So
But how would you, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but how would you respond to the person that might say, well, gee, we shouldn't do away with law enforcement. We shouldn't do away with the penal system. The penal system was designed, penance, so a person could go in, spend time, think about what the wrong that they've done, and hopefully come out with a new disposition about that behavior, or a law enforcement serving as the civil authority that maintains our civil liberties. So how would you balance the antithesis? Those that are saying, hey, no, we need those, and others just say we need to either reform, repeal, or do away with them. We got a couple minutes left.
Well, I would say, I mean, again, this is part of why I root in history, because I think when you look at the historical foundations of the prison system and the police, you see that their purpose has always been a maintenance of white supremacist systems and an exploitation of communities of color. I think that that propaganda that was put out about this is why we have penitentiaries actually did not match up with the ultimate goal or the way that prisons were and are utilized. And so we don't have enough time, like that's a whole nother presentation. But you know, I'd encourage people to do research. Actually, a local author here in Portland, Christian Williams, he wrote a history of policing called Our Enemies in Blue. He's also written a lot of articles about that. Angela Davis has an amazing book called Are Prisons Obsolete? A lot of folks have read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. All of these books fundamentally show that the basis of these institutions was around white supremacist exploitation and control of potential.
I want to promote Isabel Wilkerson's CAST, C-A-S-T, which is an excellent exposition on the topic. We only got about 6 minutes left. I want to stay true because people have been hanging in it. Just two questions. They were short. There's one question that's been in here that I'm gonna ask it, but the syntax of the question I think has some problems with it. But the question is, despite exclusion laws, only one person was ever actually expelled from Oregon. Then there's a question mark. And I think what I'm struggling with the question, if you have exclusion laws, but you only want to ask if only one person was expelled. If you have exclusion laws, people are not going to come. That's a form of exclusion. So I'm not sure if you want to tackle that question, because I'm not sure if it's constructed very well.
I understand the question, and
Sure,
folks have
okay.
asked it many times before in different ways. I think
Okay.
it's incredibly important to recognize, as you said, Emmett, very clearly, the exclusion law stopped Black folks from coming. It was like putting up a flashing neon sign at the border that said, do not come here. You can go north, you can go south, but do not come here. And Black folks heard that. Again, there's a reason Portland is the whitest major city in America, because that was the intention of it. There's a reason Oregon demographics are so incredibly white. And it's not that Black folks didn't make it all the way here. I mean, I've heard all sorts of things from white folks about, Black people didn't make it to the West Coast. Well, explain Los Angeles and Oakland and even Seattle. Black folks parted around Oregon like the Red Sea, because Oregon as a state very clearly continued the messaging that started during the Oregon Territory. You are not welcome here, and if you dare come here, there will be brutal and continual consequences for you. And so I think while only one person was legally expelled, that also doesn't take into account the numbers of Black folks who were lynched, who were run out of town, the white people who were emboldened by this ideology, that came here because of that ideology, and who used a multitude of methods, often very violent ones, to harass and brutalize and even murder Black folks who did come here.
Quick answer, just a few minutes we have left. I think there's a thing called the 1619 Project. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it.
Yes.
Which meets experiencing some resistance and so on a national basis. Could you just take a couple minutes, like a minute and a half, and just give your thoughts on that? Then I need to close this out because we'll be at the bottom of the hour. Just your thoughts on that.
My thoughts on
the 1619 Project.
I mean, I think any project that works to give, accurate information is incredibly important. And I think it's important that it's not just about memorizing, dates. It's not just about adding in information to the existing curriculum. The existing curriculum that exists across this nation and here in Oregon is an incredibly white supremacist curriculum. The fact that this history is not taught in that is very telling. And so I think any project that not only reimagines that history from the perspective of the oppressed, but shows the oppressed having agency and changing the conditions of this country is incredibly important. Because again, I just hope people walk away very clear that in Portland, in Oregon, in this nation, Black and brown folks have been active change makers, and we have fought under the most horrific, dangerous conditions to create justice, which makes all of our lives better.
How do we get the information that you're sharing into schools and academic institutions?
So there was an ethnic studies requirement that passed in the state legislature a few years ago. And so they're working on that curriculum now. I am in conversation with folks, and I'm hopeful that this information will be included in that ethnic studies requirement. But I would encourage everyone to contact educators, to contact the education department, and to just be clear, like, this needs to be in there, because it won't be unveiled for another few years. And so there is time to make sure that it is done deeply and it is done well. And I hope that's what's happened. And I rely and trust the work of the people and not institutions to make those changes.
Walida, on behalf of the organizations, we want to thank you so much for an excellent presentation. Thank you for setting aside time to ask questions. As the moderator, I want to say to folks, we sincerely apologize that if you had a question and it didn't get asked, just trying to do the best we can to keep some symmetry in the questions. And one of the things I would hope, Walida, that maybe we can have you back in the future, And maybe it's not so much a presentation. Maybe we could take an hour, hour, 15 minutes, and we just simply ask the questions that people have in the Q&A, because you did an outstanding job in the very limited time that we have to answer those questions. Again, on behalf of the sponsoring organization, we thank you very much. We wish you the very best, and we hope to see you again soon, okay?
Thank you. And
Thank
thank
you
you
so
for
much.
such an amazing job, Emma. I would love to be in conversation with you again.
Yeah, maybe we have a cup of coffee one day and I can go a little deeper.
That would be wonderful.
All right,
And
thank you
thank you
so
everyone
much.
for listening, and thank you to the
Yeah, I don't know if Bob Hornstein wants to come back online and say anything. Or if not, we can, yeah. Bob, would you like to just close us
No,
out?
I just want to thank Walida too. That was fantastic. It was very informative. Thank you very much. And want to just remind people that next Monday at 5:30 p.m. we'll be having a program that centers around the indigenous community. So I hope you'll be able to join the Confederation of Grand Ronde Tribes and NAYA for that program. And then again, December 3rd, the Latino Network will be looking at anti-immigrant and anti-Latinx discrimination in the state of Oregon. So please plan to be with us for these important programs. And Emmett, you were fantastic as always. Can't say enough about you as well. So just all around, thanks to everyone for joining us, and have a good night.
Yeah, good night, everyone. Take care. Thank you, Walida.